Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
About a fortnight back, I had mentioned to you that I had planned to do an episode of Cut the Clutter on the state of Pakistan's economy, or in fact, the hastening downslide in Pakistan's economy. That was to come shortly after the IMF agreed to give Pakistan yet another bailout, that is Pakistan's 24th bailout. We have said earlier that Pakistan is an IMF addict. What happens to an addict? That as an addict takes a shot of whatever they are addicted to, right? The moment the effect sort of wears off, you end up more fatigued, more tired, more run down, but your body wants more of the same shot. That is the IMF addiction that Pakistan's got. 24 IMF bailouts is not a small thing. It's a lot of IMF bailouts. In fact, we had made comparisons with other countries, including India, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh in an earlier episode of Cut the Clutter, of which I will share a copy. Now, this bailout has come from IMF. However, this will also be what the last one was. This will only be a band-aid. Because look at the state of Pakistan's economy right now. And ultimately, economy is tied in with politics. It's also tied in with polity, with the unique kind of polity that Pakistan has, the unique kind of balance or lack of balance, you might say, or unique kind of compact and modus vivendi that exists between the Pakistani political class, Pakistani military and Pakistan's people. I will talk about that towards the end a little bit, because if you start talking about Pakistan's politics, that will take forever and I can do that en passant any day for you, because nothing really dramatically new has happened there. That said, the state of the economy. The state of the economy is such that almost any country in the world, barring maybe Angola, Yemen, countries like that. In some cases, Egypt, that's also in a pretty bad way. Barring those countries, Pakistan at this point on most parameters seems worse than most of the other developing countries. And where do we have that from? I would refer you to this report. It's a marvelous, not a long report, 18-page report. Maybe someday we might feature this in a full episode of Cut the Clutter. This is a report by UNCTAD. UNCTAD is United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And this report is headlined "A Word of Debt." This is a UN agency. So their idea is to say that, look, developing world is now drowning under the weight of debt, burden of debt. Unless the developed world, the richer world does something about this, these large populations, countries with large populations will go down under. That is where Pakistan finds sort of the place of pride. I say that in quotes because it is meant to be sarcastic. Now, where do I get the reference to this UNCTAD report? The reference to the UNCTAD report has come from an article in Financial Times. It's a long article. We can't share it with you. We can only share it with subscribers. You will, however, see the headline and the top page of the article on your screens. The article is headlined "Pakistan's latest reality denying IMF program." And the subhead of the article is "Debt will tear us apart again." Debt, D-E-B-T. Debt will tear us apart again. This article is by Murtaza Syed, who was once an active governor of State Bank of Pakistan, which is Pakistan's equivalent of the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank in Pakistan. He was the acting governor once. He's also worked with the IMF. So he, in his long article, from which I will make some references, I'll pick up some references, he refers to this UNCTAD report, and that's where we find a lot of this other data. Now, if you look at all of this data, you also look at IMF's staff level agreement that they have signed with Pakistan, IMF's other reports on Pakistan, and World Bank projections on Pakistan, and the current data coming out of Pakistani databases and the media. Then you see the problems, the dire straits in which the Pakistan's economy is right now. Pakistan's economic growth this year will be just about 0.2%. 0.2%, although it was suspected that it might go in the negative territory, but it's 0.2%. This is coming on top of one more year of really indifferent growth. Very little to write home about. So it's 0.2%. The optimistic projections for this year are 1.8%. IMF says if their program, which has come wrapped in this 7 billion, the latest $7 billion largest for Pakistan, if that program is implemented, Pakistan might get up to 2% of growth this year. 2%. That's too little. That's too little. What that means is if a country that size, that population, and with that population growth rate, Pakistan's population growth rate is still quite high. I would say Pakistan's fertility rate would be 3.4% per year. With this kind of indifferent growth rates, per capita income doesn't go up because whatever additional income comes in the GDP is taken up by more people coming into population. So for a decade now, Pakistan's per capita GDP has almost remained stagnant. What is the upshot? The upshot is that at this point, Pakistan's per capita income is $1,407, 1407, which is almost exactly a half of Bangladesh's and India's. In fact, if you look at India's growth projections, which are international growth projections by IMF, World Bank, the international rating agencies, it looks like India will continue to widen this gap at a very rapid pace with Pakistan. This is something I've said to you maybe 5 times before, but I will say it for the 6th time that the first time I went to Pakistan in 1985, I was quite taken aback to see, it was quite visible that average Pakistani lived much better than the average Indian. And the fact is, in 1985, Pakistan's per capita income was 65% higher than India's. At this point, it's about a half and gap is increasing. So that's one more indicator of the stress on Pakistan's economy. Fiscal deficit on paper may not look so bad, 5.5%. After all, India also just finished the year with 5.1%, and now the finance minister is targeting 4.9% going ahead and 4.5% in the year after that. But India has got a lot else going for it. India has got a lot of growth going for it, right? Pakistan right now is 5.5, but if we see IMF, World Bank reports, they predict that over the next 5 years, it will go up to 8% of GDP fiscal deficit, and then will probably begin to decline. But 5 years is a very long time in any human being's life, particularly the life of a human being that's already dealing with 20% inflation, 19.6% right now, and projected by the World Bank and IMF, World Bank more precisely, to go up to 26% in the short run. That is the kind of inflation the Pakistanis are facing. I just picked up one factoid for you because I saw one Pakistani commentator say, how will our people afford milk when the milk costs the equivalent of $1.33 per liter? Now, it didn't say full cream milk or maybe semi-skimmed or skimmed milk, but let's just take full cream milk. So if it's $1.33 per liter in Pakistan, it would be 370 Pakistani rupees per liter. Pakistani rupee at this point is 278 to a dollar. So remember, it's about 1/3 the value of the Indian rupee to the dollar. If we converted this into Indian rupees, it will be something like 122 rupees per liter. What is the price of full cream milk in India right now? Full cream milk, I'm sure your neighborhood Gwala or dairy will give it to you cheaper, but full cream milk, I just checked from Mother Dairy, is 68 rupees. So average Pakistani is paying in straightforward dollar denominated terms, that is to equalize the value of currencies to account for that, about twice as much per liter of milk as the average Indian. And if you've seen the proceedings of our parliament, which are going on right now, opposition members have been complaining about rising milk prices in these proceedings. So this gives you an idea of the kind of stresses and privations Pakistan's common people are facing. Now, what is it that Murtaza Syed is saying? Murtaza Syed is saying that IMF, while they have given Pakistan more money, all they've done is kick the can down the road because they have stopped short of calling Pakistan's debts unsustainable, which is a fact, he says. He says you can be in denial of this fact and kick this can down the road and give Pakistan a little more money, hoping that someone else will come and resolve this problem. But the fact is that Pakistan cannot afford to repay the debt that it has built up, the deficits it's built up, its interest burden, and at this point, its stress on its economy and its finances is so great that this is greatly blighting the Pakistani state's ability to govern itself. For example, he quotes from the IMF report, and IMF report earlier said that the path to sustainability is narrow. All these adjectives are in quotes. The path to sustainability is narrow and acute, exceptional, and uncomfortably high risk. Right? After saying all this, IMF gives money to Pakistan. What this does is, Murtaza Syed says is that maybe IMF is afraid that if they spoke more of the truth, more clearly, then that'll set panic among Pakistan's existing lenders. But the fact is, all lenders know the reality, and panic, if anything, has already set in. However, many of them have strategic or maybe even ideological stakes in the survival of the Pakistani state that we'll talk about as we go along. I'm saying that. Murtaza Syed, in fairness, is not saying that. I'm adding that. Murtaza Syed says that in fund speak, in the way that the IMF speaks, he's worked at IMF, by the way, as we told you earlier. He says in fund speak, this is like an SOS. This is like an SOS, and they wrote this report, and yet month later, they gave Pakistan the new installment of their loan, that is $7 billion. So he says this game of extend and pretend is going on. And what this will do is that because these loans come with many conditionalities, and these will enforce extreme austerity on Pakistan's people. Because if Pakistan has to reduce its deficit, control its current account deficit, basically get its house in order, it has to enforce a great amount of austerity on its people. As inflation is going up, people have already been suffering, particularly with rising energy prices, electricity and gas in Pakistan. If that happens, he fears that Pakistan could see on the streets a kind of social rebellion that we are watching unfold in Kenya right now. In fact, that's one more subject that we should talk about one of these days in Cut the Clutter. So Kenya is seeing these protests, and what happens if this happens in Pakistan? After all, it is the fifth largest country in the world by population, right? It will be impossible then to manage the situation on the street. And he says if that happens, then the reputation of the IMF in Pakistan, which is already sullied, will be in tatter. Now, what exactly is the burden on Pakistan? Debt. There are various ways of looking at an economic situation. Debt is a very good way, even if you want to look at the health of a household, economy of a household, or of an individual. One good way to say is the family, is the individual indebted? And if you are carrying debt, how much of the debt it is? Do you have collateral to match that debt? And do you have the incomes to repay that debt? In fact, more important than income, do you have the surplus in your income to service that debt? If you have to pay back 100 rupees a month to your lender, right? And your expense is 900 rupees a month. I'm keeping it very simple. Then you must earn 1,000 rupees, at least 1,000 rupees to be able to service that debt. But if you're only earning 850 rupees, how will you service that debt? Or if your income is just 1,000 rupees, your expense is 900 rupees, but you have to pay 300 rupees to service that debt, how will you survive? You can only go downhill, and either you go downhill and self-destruct, or what do? You go out and borrow more money. And borrowing more money is what Pakistani state has been doing for many years now. Look at some data. If you look at Pakistan's data coming out of global multilateral institutions. Pakistan will need the equivalent of 19 billion, 19 billion dollars per year, at least for the next 5 years, to continue repaying the principal on its debt, over the next 5 years. How much is 19 billion for a country like Pakistan, for an economy the size of Pakistan? It is at this point exactly about 50% of its export. So 50% of their export and incomes they have to use for repaying their external debt, not domestic debt, external debt, the principal. Then what is their interest burden? Interest burden, and this is again foreign debt, $6 billion per year for the next 5 years is the interest burden. Now, if you see this with the current account deficit that Pakistan's already running, it's going to be very difficult to find this money to service this debt. We look at some data on current accounts as we go along. If you add this, Murtaza Sayed says this is $25 billion per year till 2029 in just external debt repayment. This at a time when Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves are just $9.5 billion. $9.5 billion for Pakistan would be something like the equivalent of 6 weeks of imports. It's really low. The minimum requirement the IMF puts is you should have at least a reasonable country, stable country, or at least basically stable country should have foreign exchange at least to fund 3 months of imports. This is only 6 weeks of imports, $9.5 billion. You can make comparisons, you know how much India's foreign exchange reserves are, or maybe other countries, but that is not relevant right now. I think 9.5 billion looks like a very small amount. I can name you 50 companies listed on your stock markets which will have more reserves than this over 5 years now. Now, if you take all of Pakistan's debt across the next 5 years, 6.5% of Pakistan's GDP, the equivalent of 6.5% of Pakistan's GDP, will just have to be spent in repayment of interest to domestic and foreign lenders. 6.5% of GDP is serious money. For comparisons, for reference, India's defense budget, all of India's defense budget, including salaries, pensions, everything, Army, Navy, Air Force, all of India's defense budget this year is 1.89% of India's GDP. So, a country's GDP is a large amount. If a country has to pay over 5 years, the next 5 years, 6.5% equivalent of its GDP to its domestic and foreign lenders. Just interest payments. In just interest payments, you can imagine what will happen. That at a time when the country's total tax revenues are just about 10% of their GDP, which means nearly 65% of their tax revenues will just be spent in paying interest on their existing borrowings. That's the reason we started out by saying that this is a country that's become a debt addict. And later, as we use some data from the UNCTAD report, you will see some comparisons which will be quite telling. Now, Pakistan has very little FDI. Last year, it was about $2 billion, and we don't know what that consisted of. Even 2 billion sounds dodgy, but it was $2 billion last year. Private sector in Pakistan is not growing. It's stalled. Private sector is not investing. And that in spite of the fact that the Pakistani army, in its eternal faith in its superhuman, maybe divine capabilities, has set up a group. It has set up a group or a committee, you can call it, led by none else than the almighty army chief, General Asim Munir. This is called Special Investment Facilitation Council, SIFC. So far, it's been able to bring in very little money, because anybody bringing in money has to first see stability, which is political, and which is also a smoothing of the inter-institutional relationships in Pakistan, which at this point of time are completely short. We'll talk about that just a little bit in conclusion. Coming back, however, to the basic data on the economy. The $7 billion that IMF pays Pakistan right now will be needed just for Pakistan's repayment of existing loans to IMF over the next 4 years. So this is like evergreening. This is like what used to happen in our country, what was called phone banking. In the second half of UPA, in the second term of UPA, second half of the second term of UPA, so many of our borrowers who were not able to return their loans to the bank, instead of being taken to bankruptcy or banks possessing their assets as they would from a home buyer, if the home buyer was not able to repay their, or home buyer or vehicle buyer was not able to repay their EMIs, the bank will come and repossess your car, motorbike, home, anything. Indian banks were not allowed to do that, or maybe they were not inclined. That was not the culture to do that with Indian corporates. That's only started now with the bankruptcy code coming in. So what they did was they just lent their borrowers more money. That look, you owe me 10,000 crores, I lend you another 10,000 crores. So you pay me back. That means your loan is paid. A new loan starts now. That is called evergreening of loans, and we know how that ended up. That's precisely what IMF is done right now. But the fact is that IMF knows that they've done it 23 times in the past, and each time it's had the same consequence. In fact, if you look at the IMF's conditions and the kind of growth and the stability the IMF wants, and the deficits, the reduction in deficits the IMF wants, Pakistan will have to run a surplus economy for the next many years, something that happened only once more than 20 years back at the peak of the war on terror era, when grants were flowing in from the Western world, particularly the Americans, with no questions asked, because Pakistan was then hailed as a stalwart ally in war against terror, which means in war against Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, and forces linked to him in Afghanistan. Since then, barring that one exception, Pakistan hasn't run a surplus budget, and to think that Pakistan will run a surplus economy going ahead sounds very, very unreal. Now, look at some further data. Pakistan's gross financing needs. What is gross financing needs? That is budget deficit, because when you have a budget deficit, you borrow, right? In fact, Government of India is now saying that going ahead, we will not calculate our deficit as a percentage of GDP. We will calculate our borrowing figures, and we'll try and bring down our borrowing figures, our debt. So budget deficit has to be financed. Budget deficit and gross financing needs include budget deficit plus debt which becomes due for repayment. If you add these two, then according to this UNCTAD data, Pakistan's is the second highest among emerging markets. Second highest. Who's the top of the pops? It's Egypt. Egypt is the top of the pops. Pakistan is number 2. Where does India feature? India also has a high debt burden. India also has deficit on the budget. India, however, ranks at number 14. India would like that rank to be even higher by number in this case, because higher is better. But India is 14. Again, UNCTAD data, the ranking of countries in terms of percentage of GDP required to be paid just for interest payments among developing countries. Pakistan at 6% is almost at the top, at 65% of its revenues to be used as interest payment. It is the second worst in the world, or you can say second from the top. Who's at the top? It's Sri Lanka. So Pakistan comes next, just to Sri Lanka, which recently had that big meltdown. Given this, Pakistan spends 3 times. I'm taking this from Murtaza Syed's article because that's drawn from the UNCTAD report, and basic UNCTAD report is with you. Pakistan is spending 3 times as much on interest payments as on education. That makes Pakistan the second worst again after Sri Lanka. Although Sri Lanka has invested a lot in education in the past, Sri Lanka's social indicators already, particularly on education and literacy, are much, much, much better. On literacy, it's almost 100%. Again, Pakistan will spend 6 times more on interest repayments than on health. In this case, Pakistan is not number 1 or number 2. Pakistan is number 4. See who are the countries Pakistan is less worse than. That is Yemen, Angola, and Egypt. Pakistan will spend 2 times more on interest than it invests in its economy for growth, etc. There, Pakistan is third from the top, if you see the top like that. And who are the countries ahead of Pakistan in this ranking? Angola and Lebanon. Pakistan will now be spending only 12% of its GDP on growth, whereas nearly 30% is at least needed. So this is less than 40%, or about a 40% of the minimum a country needs to spend on of its resources on growing its GDP. So all of this gives us an idea of the state of Pakistan's economy. I told you early on that economy of a country, particularly a large country like Pakistan, fifth largest country in the world by population, is very deeply linked to its politics. Pakistan's politics has been broken for a long time, and that we know also from the fact that no prime minister in Pakistan has completed their full term, right? So right now Pakistan has this unusual arrangement whereby there is a quote unquote elected government which probably does not have a deserved majority. This was a fixed election, as we know. It's one of those junctures in Pakistan's politics where the army and the elected government are on the same page. The reason no prime minister in Pakistan has completed their full term is because at some point the army gets impatient with the prime minister, and the army and the establishment get together and remove the prime minister. In this case, the army it was that removed Nawaz Sharif in 2017, brought in by rigging the election and rigging the post-election coalition making process. They rigged the entire process to install Imran Khan as the prime minister. Soon enough, Imran Khan started behaving like he thought he was a real prime minister, and he became an Islamist and became very anti-American, etc., etc. And he started saying and doing things that the army didn't like, so they had to get rid of him. Right? Imran Khan also tried to defy the army. For example, after the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan, they wanted facilities in Pakistan so they could carry out operations against those they saw as terrorists on the Afghan soil. Imran Khan said no. His army would have liked to accommodate the Americans. Similarly, his army did not want him to go to Moscow to meet Putin because that was going to annoy the Americans. He did that. Ukraine got invaded while he was there. He even attended a lunch with Putin while he was there, and that is something that drew direct censure from Jake Sullivan, the American National Security Advisor. The army was not pleased, they were furious. And the third thing he did was he messed with the army's own internal appointment process over the appointment of the new ISI chief. And that was the last straw. And that's when the army decided to get rid of him. So they got rid of him. And then they held this election where before the election, everything was fixed. So Imran Khan's party was de-recognized, yet his people contested as independents while he was in jail, his wife was in jail, right? And almost 70-80 of these independents got elected. In fact, if you do a real count, it would look like that if you put all these independents together, this was the largest party in the national parliament. They were, however, denied that space. The other parties, that is Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and the Bhutto party, PPP, Pakistan People's Party, from outside, they came together with some of the others, and army put together a government. And that's a government which is now running at the sufferance of the army, meaning General Asim Munir. And if you look at this economic landscape, who's going to put things back together? It's Shehbaz Sharif's government. This is a completely broken arrangement in Pakistan, where the supposedly elected government doesn't have a majority. Supposedly elected government is in partnership with the army. That is not the kind of thing that happens in the past often, and where the judiciary is now trying to become a little bit equidistant or at least less predictable. It's in that situation that things have to be put together, and a blood feud is playing out between Imran Khan and Asim Munir, the army chief. In fact, I will share with you a long article, 5,000 word plus article by Tom Stevenson in London Review of Books. Please read that. It's a very interesting article, very well written. That tells you what the political situation in Pakistan is. And I like the metaphor he uses in his article, which is also the headline, one grave, two bodies. So this is a bit like Imran Khan and Asim Munir are fighting. One will perish, one will survive. We will have more time to talk about this in greater detail, maybe in days to come.